Hello, everyone. This is Rick Maguire. I'm the Chief Data Scientist at MDGroup, which is based in Bracknell, UK, and with offices around the world. The focus and context of this presentation is in regards to clinical trials. And as the title says, patient-centricity in the future is here now, if we care to listen and act. I'm stating that because oftentimes the voice of the customer or the patient in this case, is not listened to in terms of textual data, voice data. And it's not that it's unimportant, it's just that people don't know how to analyze it and don't recognize the importance of capturing this unstructured data source. I'll be speaking about that later on in more detail about how you do analyze that. Okay, the democratization of clinical trials is disruptive, and why is that a good thing? It's been disruptive because if clinical trials today has a lot of data coming at you, you're losing molecular data from DNA sequencing to find out who's a responder, non-responder, um, uh, microbiome for colitis type of customers, rare diseases, and then you're looking at transcriptome data, you're looking at proteome data, and you're looking at EMR data, which is usually very dirty. Having worked in a major cancer center, patients are offered it 12 different ways with 3 different sexes. Yes, that's right, 3 different sexes. And then the clinical chart from visiting nurses when you're home-based rather than site-based. So there's a lot of information to deal with. And we need to think out of the box of how we do clinical trials. And one of the forces that has forced that has been COVID-19. It's not something we all wanted or still dealing with, but it's another tsunami that has basically accelerated the move to virtual clinical trials. And virtual means remote, less site-based because hospitals have been tied down with dealing with COVID-19 patients and not letting in patients for clinical trials. That may be opening up in certain sectors, but there's still a need for having home-based care for the clinical trials. So it's shifted to virtual trials, also known as remote trials, and I think eventually it will move to hybrid. I don't think site-based goes away, but I think it's important, except for certain diseases like rare diseases, therapeutic areas rather, rare diseases in oncology where there has to be infusion, that maybe site has to still stay there more directly than other therapeutic areas. But the reality is there are challenges with this pivot, and major pharma have had issues with moving towards that and have asked for assistance from a number of companies because site-based personnel don't always have the understanding or skill for virtual trials. For instance, when you're dealing virtually, you have to have a home health nurse come and visit. They have to draw blood. They have to submit a clinical chart remotely via email or a portal, if you will. They also have to have an understanding of how to deal with wearable sensor data. Increasingly, that's important, and I'll go into more detail about its importance a little later on in this discussion. But there's a lot coming at you with unstructured and structured data, and the personnel that are site-based may not have the right skill set or understanding that needing to train patients about the need to wear and be compliant with wearing their sensors, because without that, you can't denote who's being compliant with the activity required. You can actually discern activity through physiological measurement so that it isn't necessarily a direct measurement, but you can actually discern that indirectly. So it's a way to keep patients clued in, but you need to train them about changing batteries, something as simple as that, and also wearing the sensors so that we can accumulate all of this data physiologically for looking at adverse effects and other things. So the question is, are you ready for streaming data from wearables? If you're not, then it's eye-opening in terms of smaller studies is not as huge an issue, but when you have 25,000 patients across 18 countries and you have streaming data coming at you, it's high velocity data. And if you're not ready for it, and it can be noisy, you have to buck out the noise to signal, so you have a clean signal so you can discern what's going on with the patient. The benefits are actually pretty substantial with wearable sensor data. Since it's continuous data versus site-based episodic, there's improved accuracy. When you go to a site, unless it is specific therapeutics like rare disease and oncology, where you may have to be there for weeks or months at a time, generally speaking, you come and visit for a day or two and you're gone. So it's like going to your primary care physician, getting blood tests, getting seen by the physician and leaving. It's a point in time measurement. It's not continuous. So it's less accurate than having a continuous read of your physiological data. Because actually, having worked with a company in Singapore now based in Boston called Bioformus, they can actually discern using AI, looking at physiological data, someone who's a patient that's going to have an infarct or heart attack during a clinical trial is 14 days before it actually happens. And with an 85% accuracy or better, that's pretty substantial. So there's value to wearables if you choose to use them. And a lot of farmers were beginning to move to that. COVID-19 has forced the issue to move more directly to that. So managing the big wave is from the tsunami picture that you saw towards the beginning. Talking about something that's less sexy, but if you're a data scientist, matters a lot. It requires performant infrastructure, also known as middleware, that most people in this space don't speak about. But you have to manage not only the data size and types, but it's both structured and unstructured data. And increasingly, it's a lot of unstructured data that does not fit into a relational or structured table. Unstructured data is like the DNA sequencing data, transcriptomic data. It's also textual data and voice data, which I'll go into in more detail a bit later on. So oftentimes, a lot of the data is not captured and we have gaps. A data lake, however, allows you to manage the wave of data coming at you by capturing all of your data, structured and unstructured. It matters because if you're missing data sets, you're missing the value of what can come to retain patients from textual voice data, and also from the molecular data coming at you, that you have the ability to be predictive about response time, the responsiveness to a certain therapeutic drug. The next step is to store the data in a proper data store for data type, structured, unstructured again, ensure that the data is clean. Some of these data sources are noisy, and you don't want to be using analytics on noisy data or dirty data. EMRs are notoriously dirty, so you have to clean that up, and that's the source of your demographic for your patient. Also the source of your medical chart that's coming from now your remote nurse at the patient's house or apartment. And it matters that you have the ability to clean this data coming in, so you're not making decisions based on noise rather than signal. Then you need to analyze the data for decision making. So there's a lot of things coming at you. Now, I have social media up here because increasingly a number of pharmaceuticals want to track what the patients are thinking outside of the clinical trial, because often patients are more honest with non-clinicians than they are with clinicians. So they tell clinicians sometimes what they think they want to hear rather than how they're actually feeling. Feeling physically, that matters because they could be having a self-reported, a patient-reported outcome, meaning an adverse effect, without realizing that it is adverse. It also reveals how they feel about the study, about the travel, if there's travel component to it, about their compensation, reimbursement, that is, if they are traveling on or have accommodations. So it matters, but you should note that if you're doing social media in this case, or even textual data, the informed consent has to reflect that. In the IRB, which the Institutional Review Board and ethics committees have to review that and approve the protocol that allows this type of analysis. But there are companies that do mine the social media for these patients. Obviously, they're identifiable. So an identified patient this is PHI, protected health information, in that context. So you need to be looking at all this data in terms of the patient records, the different communications, because you need to communicate with your patients, and oftentimes it has, in the past anyway, been relegated to an exit interview. If you want to retain patients, an exit interview is a little late because the at-risk patients probably already left by then. So you need to have some surveys, short, because you don't want to belabor the patient because they may have other issues having to deal with physically. So you want to have something that is a touch point so you can get a glimpse or an idea of how they feel physically and how they feel about the trial. And again, I'll go into that in more detail, called sentiment analysis, in a bit. But there's a lot to go through, and electronic extraction, load and transform. There's a lot of data coming at you. You need to put it into a format by which you can analyze data. And the hardest part is correlating disparate data sources. For those of us who are in this area, I think that's just a well-known subject. So why data capture and analysis is an imperative for patient retention? So if you look on the left, the patient retention graphic here is simplistic in the sense that you just put a magnet on, you track your patients and you keep them. Well, it isn't that simple, because do you really know how your patients feel about you, meaning the site, the sponsor, the CRA, the nurse, the PI, principal investigator, the travel, if there's travel involved. If you don't know, that's not good, because analyzing patient sentiment in real time matters a lot, because patients aren't necessarily always happy. They may appear to be, but what they state becomes something that you can actually act on. I mean, if somebody issues a declarative statement, I hate this trial, you don't need analysis to figure out that that patient's at risk for leaving. But normally it's more obtuse than that and less clear. So you need a way to analyze that textual voice data to intervene before a patient leaves the trial. So this is where the analysis and the prediction capabilities in machine learning actually do help in terms of being ability to not be reactive, but to be interventional before a patient leaves. So if we capture, what if we capture actionable data to predict when a patient may leave a study? Is that important to you? Excuse me. There's a lot of reasons, and these are just a few of the reasons the patients state for leaving a study. Inconvenient location. If you're not, well, if it's their house, it's probably convenient. But in today's world with COVID-19, there's scheduling conflicts, it's personal family matters, they're physically unable. Financial constraints, lack of appreciation is usually a large one for getting visits, fear and anxiety. There's some, rather than text and voice, you can actually track patient behavior too. So if they're missing visits, that's a good indicator that a patient is not fully involved and compliant, certainly, in the clinical trial, and you need to have intervention to keep them. So you have to understand the dichotomy here of the reasons why patients leave, and you have to mine every available source of data that you can to keep them. And oftentimes some of this data is missed. So if we look at the importance of data, actionable data, excuse me, as clinical trials become more data-driven, all of us need to listen. It's progressing on its own, pardon me. Listen more attentively to the patient for actionable data. Brother. So that means clinical nurses and project managers and travel professionals even, excuse me, need to be trained to listen to patient sentiment, both text and voice. I don't know why it's doing this, because it's not trained to do it. So proactively capturing patient sentiments is really a big deal. How they feel physically about is something you can intervene with, because they may be having a patient-reported outcome, and this is the voice of the customer that rarely gets listened to. Pardon me. So we need to listen to the patient, and also listen to them about how they feel about the trial, the CRO, the sponsor, the site, whatever. And it becomes actionable data, meaning you can intervene before a patient decides to leave your clinical trial. And there's a number of ways we can do this. Textual data, voice data, is often forgotten. And it's not because it's unimportant, it's just because it's siloed if it's captured at all. It's because a lot of people just don't know how to manage it, and some don't recognize its value. Natural language processing, or NLP, is one way that we can do this. It uses linguistic parsing and semantic tagging to uncover patterns that can be deployed in predictive analytics and machine learning downstream from it. So simplistically, on the right is the semantic tagging, and the size of the word string or the word itself is a function of how frequent it is repeated in a textual voice stream from patient or patients, and therefore its importance should be looked at accordingly. But the more important one is linguistic parsing, looking at the verb, the adjective, the noun, and understanding that NLP can capture the context, not just the pattern in the data. For those of us who are data scientists, it's an old adage, but it's true that if you capture data without context, what you have is noise. So if you capture the context in which something is stated, then you have more meaning in that captured pattern, and you can actually do something with it and intervene. So it's the challenge of the bigness of the data or its complexity. I'd argue it's the complexity, because as I mentioned, clinical trials increasingly are using molecular data from DNA sequencing, transcriptomics, metabolomics, microbiome, proteomics. There's a lot of omics. And then you have the EHR, electronic medical record, and electronic chart, in medical chart, that is. And you need to make sense of all this data in a way that makes sense, and to correlate them across disparate, or what I call disparate data, often is something that is data can get into data wrangling. But we need to make this more simple for the people on the front lines, because navigating the clinical trial complexity isn't always about the bigness of the data. It's also about the high velocity, as I mentioned, Internet of Things, sensor data coming from remote patients. And how do you correlate disparate data? Each of these roles, clinicians, study managers, CRAs, clinical research associates, and even the patient, have needs of understanding of what's going on, or the need to respond back to the site, in the case of the patient, for voice of the patient, of how they're feeling, as I mentioned. And this is something that should be actively pursued in terms of the how they feel physically, so you can intervene for potential adverse effects that may not be captured directly from the physiological sensor data, and also how they feel about the study in general, and in the various personnel that you're dealing with. Because if you use natural language processing and use downstream processing for machine learning and predictive analytics, you can actually predict who's an at-risk patient, and therefore intervene before they leave the study. If you go back to the reasons that people leave, it's a pretty known fact that about 30% of patients leave a study. And for some studies, that's catastrophic, because rare diseases often have many clinical trials have very narrow cohorts. So if you start looking at how to augment that with real-world data, for instance, and I've used the UK Biobank, and some companies have their own data source of patients and registries and such. You can actually broaden the understanding of who is a responder, non-responder, and look at it from molecular, as well as the responsive to dosaging through the physiological measurements. So there's a lot that we need to make, democratize the access, because oftentimes the people on the front lines, the clinicians, don't have direct access. And oftentimes they're sitting there waiting for the analysis to happen. It's pretty well known that a lot of certainly smaller biotechs don't have the bandwidth for having a lot of data scientists, bioinformaticians, biostatisticians. So we need to simplify insofar as we can the ability to not only access this data, but to make sense of it. It doesn't mean that the role of the subject matter experts goes away, far from it. But if you build an analytics pipeline, which in the case of textual and voice data comprises natural language processing, machine learning, and predictive analytics, you can actually have something that is something that the frontline people can access and make sense of and intervene before something happens, meaning the patient leaving the study. So we need to democratize in that sense, because right now it's often siloed. And certainly there are regulatory issues here that not everybody gets to see everything, and I understand that. But certainly by their role in the software capabilities today, you can basically make sure that people are only looking at what they need to look at, and also have an audit trail of who is involved and who's making decisions. So the patient Internet of Things, streaming data at high velocity, and smart watches from Apple and other sources and virtual reality thing is something that's being used, but the digitalization of clinical trials is certainly well underway. So wearable sensors and virtual trials, the role of disruptive technology. I would argue that firstly, you need to think a lot long and hard about the choice of physiological sensor. Having a single point, meaning a blood pressure monitor, is not sufficient because you want to have multi-parameter physiological monitoring so the patient doesn't have to wear more than one device. You have to understand that it's an invasion of their privacy, and you have to have something that is form, fit, and fashion for what you need to capture. So this training issues here for the patient or their advocates, so that they are adhering to using the devices and making sure that the devices have battery changes when needed, because these are continuous read devices. The user interaction interface is incredibly important, whether it be a mobile app, not only for the patient, but for the various constituencies as identified earlier in terms of the clinician or the CRA or nurses, and looking at smartwatches and other devices that we need to understand. Since this is a regulatory environment, black boxes, what happened in the past, are not something that you consider here. You need to be transparent. So that for both the collection, the filtering, the analysis, and the decision making, and having an audit trail for the whole 9 yards. So that we understand today the analytics has to be pretty well exposed as to what it's doing and how it derives its decisions. So remote access is incredibly important now that we have COVID-19. So FaceTime, Microsoft Teams, Skype, or whatever, what you're using is something where the clinical staff from the site can interface with the patient. Also, the site nurses who go to visit for medical chart, for drawing blood or sputum or whatever, and making sure that they are reporting back this information to the medical database. Because the hospital now is sort of out of the loop. It may start coming back in certain areas as hospitals open up for other things other than COVID-19. But we're seeing spikes in areas that, so COVID-19 isn't going away anytime soon. So we need to understand the new reality and understand that we need to have full access by role within regulatory compliance. So wearable sensors and virtual trials. The major benefit, as I mentioned, is continuous, for at-home clinical trials, continuous patient sensor data, so not episodic, not a single point in time. This means making correlations and predictions more accurate. The challenge is the size of the data stream, as it's becoming a tsunami when you add in not just the streaming data from sensors, but the DNA sequencing data from the extracted blood that's extracted for DNA and RNA. And then the size of this data becomes a tsunami, in short, because of the volume and the types of data coming at you, structured and unstructured. So data management and data cleaning are paramount. You need to understand that you have to have an architecture that can support meaning the infrastructure that I said is not the sexy part, but you have to have the environment which can support compute at scale, because if you have latency, you can't have real-time decision making. In virtual clinical trials, the future is here now. So we need to understand the new reality is at home clinical trials is here to stay. Sites don't go away, but we need to understand that the pivot to at home is already happened, and the digitalization is making it easier, not sorry, easy, but easier to actually accomplish the goals that once were site-based. I'm stopping this a little short because I had throat surgery, and it's a challenge to go on, but I didn't want to not go on with the show, if you will. So I'm going to probably end here a bit, about half an hour early. I apologize, but um, um, my voice is not going to hold out here. So if there are any questions, I guess this is the time, if there's a vehicle for asking, to ask. If you have any questions, please type them in. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, a question just came up. What do you have as a reference for remote capture systems for clinical? Oops, there's a lot more. Remote capture for systems for clinical patients. Um, I'm not sure what the question is in terms of if the reference is the type of device being used. I'm not sure. Um, Obviously, you need to have remote capture. You need to have bandwidth. In isolated areas, you need to have the ability to have connection for wireless, or to have an ability to upload the data. And so there may be some synchronicity issues in some remote areas, but generally in urban areas, that's not an issue, or even residential areas outside of cities. Um, how do you combine all data with privacy? That's a good question. Privacy trumps everything in the terms of what the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, and informed consent allow. The patient has to be consented for the capture of any protected health information. So not all data is available for everyone. It's role-based, so that the privacy is protected by the softwares that's available. So not everyone sees everything. So you need to you have to acknowledge this up front, that when you go to this directionality to capture textual data, for instance, a voice as an example, that the IRB has to allow it, and the informed consent has to be agreed to by patient. Otherwise, you can't be collecting this data. So there's this a string attached with any data with patient privacy in a regulated space. What databases do you recommend for the data lake? Well, we're talking structured and unstructured, so no SQL for unstructured sort of data. There's a lot of PostgreSQL, MySQL, Oracle, IBM. There's a lot of data providers for data lakes that are out there. I've used Oracle, having worked there actually. And so, and use NoSQL for unstructured data, because not everything fits into relational tables. Textual The raw data, certainly from sequencers, does not fit in. That's unstructured data. It's more in a Hadoop environment. So you need to understand the type of data that you're capturing and where it can best sit. What role do you see advances in NLU playing in this? Is that NLP, maybe? That's what that. The role I see for advances in natural language processing is that more of an awareness of its capability. NLP has been used in a variety of areas within life sciences. It has been not well used, if at all, in the context of clinical trials. So I think it's basically an education of the site-based people, the sponsors, about the value of capturing textual, voice, and transcribed data, for that matter, in that you need to understand the value of the voice of the customer. And they could become also not through direct interaction with the patient, through periodic surveys of them, but not being too detailed because you don't want to load them down. But you also want to capture how they feel and how they feel about the study. You need to be proactive. You need to listen, but you need to go out to them and engage the patient, because most want to be engaged, or they wouldn't have signed up. Let's see. Have your team been using remote clinical for phase 2 or phase 3 or both of them already? Just thinking of the size of the data. Good question. Actually, both. It's been mostly in phase 3, not phase 2, but it's something we've been active in terms of using remote clinical. I mean, some of the pharmaceuticals like AbbVie and Amgen have been light years, and Lilly in some respects have been light years of being sensor first. That's a new directionality. I think COVID-19 has pushed other large pharma and biotechs to understand the value, because otherwise the clinical trials can't happen. So there's been a rush to repopulate clinical trials with home-based nursing. So there's a lot of catch-up to do, a lot of understanding, because as I said, sometimes the site-based personnel don't have the right understanding of the types of data coming at them from streaming data, and what that means and what you have to capture, and also the training required to keep patients adhering to the use of those sensors. Because if you lose that, you lose the ability to be connected to the patient, at least clinically from the physiological measurements. So that's what I'd argue. What is the likely volume of virtual clinical examination the coming year? That's a good question. I don't have an open view into the future necessarily, but the volume seems to be increasing orthogonally, because increasingly clinical trials are using DNA sequencing, molecular data from a variety of sources, as I mentioned, transcriptomics, metabolomics from mass spec, and proteomics similarly, in microbiome for certain disease therapeutic areas where that's appropriate, like Crohn's and colitis. But it seems to me that the volume of data coming out is a lot more than it has been in the past. And certainly if you go to sensor-based remote, it's not episodic visits. So the volume of the data from physiological measurement is not a point in time. It's continuous for 2 weeks to months at a time. Excuse me. So we have to understand that the volume, you have to be prepared for the deluge. Because if you're not collecting molecular data now to see who's a responder, non-responder, then you should be thinking of that, and also broadening your cohorts by using real-world data. As I mentioned, I had used the UK Biobank, but there are patient registries out there that can be used through the appropriate IRBs to basically augment and diversify what often is a very narrow cohort in clinical trials. So that's a lot of data. When you start looking at the UK Biobank as an example, I mean, it's millions of data points because they do have molecular data in there. I am available for questions at another time. My address is richard.maguire, Maguire. I don't know if you can read it on this chart, screen rather, at mdgroup.com. So you're more than welcome to correspond with me in that way. What recommendations for data lake platforms and requirements? I think I answered that. How do you think the user interaction interfaces at the moment for the remote clinical trials, comparing to other well-being type of applications? Are they well-designed for easy use? That's a good question. I think that's why I emphasize the importance of choosing the sensor wisely. A single point measurement physiologically is not sufficient, meaning a blood pressure. You need to choose not only the form, fit, and fashion of the measurements you need to capture if they are not at your site, but they're remote, that a visiting nurse may not be able to capture by themselves. So we need to understand that there's a number of things we need to understand. I'm sorry, the questions are scrolling fast. But the interface can be simplistic. An Apple Watch is pretty simple, unless you're an older person. So we have to understand that one size doesn't fit all here, in the sense that some patient types are going to resist. So we have to make it simple for their advocates if the patient themselves cannot manage it. So that's something you have to think through in terms of the dynamics involved with choosing the right sensor, and also how does the sensor report back? Does it give you the details that you need, so much so that it would be equal to or better than what you have at site on a site-based? Wearable sensors are easy to use and to wear and or cumbersome. Do they require a sort of training to be used by the patient? Or did you run tests with old patients? Yeah. Okay. Wearable sensors are not necessarily always easy, and they can be cumbersome. So the choice, recognizing that the patient has to be involved in decision making, or their advocates. You have to understand that an older patient in particular, or a sick patient, is probably going to resist more than somebody who's not as medically challenged or have comorbidities. So we have to understand that there is a training component to this, not only for the patient, but for their advocates or their families. So you have to understand that the choice of wearable matters. Simple is good so long as it captures all the physiological measurements you need. But the more cumbersome that it's going to be, the more likely the patient's not going to adhere to wearing it all the time or wearing it at all. So there's trade-offs, at least now. But I think sensors have actually, sensor types have actually been modified to be simpler and less onerous to wear than in the past. What is the trend do you see that the remote clinical trials in the old school way of clinical trials, regardless of most companies are still at certain levels of lockdown, is that much efficient or similar? I'd say, well, I don't think sites go away, certainly for certain therapeutic areas, as I mentioned, like rare disease, where your patient may have to be there for weeks or months at a time. And similarly with oncology, if infusion is involved, or immunotherapeutics. So it depends on the therapeutic area, quite frankly. But I think remote is here to stay, or virtual trials are here to stay, but more likely to be hybrid. That the importance of sites don't go away completely once we're past COVID-19, when and if that happens. So the sites become incredibly important to keep everybody monitored appropriately and standardized in terms of the measurement. But we have to understand that a good reason why people leave a study is the travel, the inconvenience. So the more we can make it convenient, the more we listen to the voice of the customer again, the more likely that remote trials are here to stay. But again, I think that the choice will be across pharmaceuticals and biotech will be, and CROs will be more the hybrid arrangement. What about security for all this data, ingesting in flight, at rest? What are we seeing? How does that slow down the real-time nature and analysis? That's an excellent point. Obviously, anything today can be hacked, pacemakers and anything like that. So data in flight is at risk. So we have to understand that we need to, when we define a clinical trial protocol, we have to have data security front and center as part of the equation. So the devices we choose, how intelligent they are, how smart they are in terms of being able to be locked down or not. You know, a Fitbit is not a secure device, nor is it clinically accurate. So you have to be aware of the choice of the devices we're using, and the volume of data does allow potentially interactions with that shouldn't be allowed. If you do this properly in terms of the data architecture and who has rights to see what, then the PHI is protected for the patient, and the informed consent is also protected. And the IRB, Institutional Review Board, and ethics committees are happy, as are the FDA regulators or NHS or whomever, that we are understanding that security is paramount. There's no getting around it. What's being done to empower the patients and their advocates to ask questions to ensure the voices are heard? Excellent point. There's a number of responses to that. If you look at certain disease groups like Crohn's and colitis, those patients know as much, it seems to me, in their families as do a lot of the clinicians. They're very much motivated. So they're basically a source that patient advocacy groups, that CROs and sponsors pharmaceuticals go to get a voice of the customer involved directly in the design of the trial. I think that's important. This is a major change in the way clinical trials have happened in the past. It was sort of like the patient was sort of a static being that you interacted with, and that was it. That's changed. The patient now, and depending on the study type, is more directly involved from the design stage all the way through. And they're actually being more participatory, being encouraged to be participatory. So there's better interaction and better adherence to not only the dosage requirements, the activity requirements, which can be denoted from the physiological measurements, that they adhere to their visit schedules, all of that. So I think that is a major change. So the patient advocacy groups are front and center with the design of clinical trials all the way through. Can I ask, what are the wearable devices that are you using in your remote clinical trials at present? I'm not sure I can answer that directly, since I haven't chosen the wearable devices. I interact with them, but I haven't chosen them. I should be more involved, quite frankly, for the security reasons that someone else had asked about. I can answer that if you correspond with my email, because I don't have that ready answer for you right here. But there are some very good ones out there. Clearly, it depends on what it is. Medtronic certainly I've used for heart. So it really depends on the therapeutic study and the type of physiological measurement you need to capture, as well as what may be an adverse effect triggering from a heart attack as a result of an adverse effect. So Medtronic can be appropriate not just for heart studies, clearly. Can we access to the PowerPoint? If you email me, I can send it to you as a PDF. So I'd be happy to do that. Again, it's richard.maguire, as you see over here on this screen, at mdgroup.com. So it's MAGUIRE. There's no C in there. So I'd be happy to send that to you. I'm not sure I answered everybody's question. Some of them I'm not sure. Just going back to see if I missed anything. What do you, okay, I think I've answered or tried to answer all of the questions. So again, if you want to correspond with me to get access to the PowerPoint as a PDF, I can send that to you. If you have other questions, you can interact with me, and I can get whoever asked the questions about what wearable devices. I can get back to you on that. But certainly, Medtronic has been one that I've interacted with a lot. So, unless there's any other questions, I think we'll probably end the session. I'll wait a little bit to see if any other questions come in. Excuse me. Well, thank you for your attention and for joining us today. I do appreciate it, and I appreciate BrightTALK sponsoring this presentation. So thank you for your time. Oh, there's one question that came in. Given the security issues with the Internet of Things in 5G, does it make sense to mix medical with this vehicle? Good question. 5G has some issues with having to be near a tower. Uh, so if you go inside around the tower 60 feet away to a coffee shop, it doesn't work. So you're back to 4G, like it or not. There are security issues certainly with Internet of Things in their hackability. So it makes sense that you choose the appropriate medical device in terms of its security level. So not just choose any old device, but mixing medical with this vehicle. I'm not sure the question is. Not sure how to answer that question. But certainly we have to be aware. But um, we're dealing with this in hospitals as well as in other places. Certainly, clinical trials is using wearable devices increasingly. So this is something we're all dealing with and having to understand how we navigate this field. But security is clearly an issue. The email again is richard.maguire, Maguire, at mdgroup.com. I can't type it in here. So if you can see over here, this is my email address. And maybe BrightTALK can respond back to you with my email address. What role do you see conversational AI playing in this? Excellent question. I've explored the use of bots using AI um, to augment site personnel. I think it's a work in progress because right now it's not as friendly as it needs to be, but it's something that we can use conversational AI to basically answer questions that patients may have or anybody in the ecosystem here. So I do see a role in that. That clearly we need to be thinking of the use of that because certainly other fields have been doing this a lot more than we have in terms of life sciences and healthcare. Retail has been doing this with bots for quite some time with pretty good results. So I think that's something we can do. I'm sorry I can't type in here for my email address, but if you're having trouble hearing me, it is over here. If you can still see my screen, richard.maguire at mdgroup.com. So this is my email address. Okay. We have 10 minutes left. If there's any other questions, I'll wait here for a bit. But again, thanks for joining. I don't see any other questions coming in, so if you're still there, please ask a question or I'll be shutting down the presentation shortly. Thank you. You're welcome. Thanks for your comment. Okay. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I'll be stop sharing and ending this presentation. So thank you again for attending, and thank BrightTALK for hosting this meeting. Thank you. Goodbye.